there are 6 Nobel Prize winners that are among the 400 economists for Romney, and of those, 2/3 are from Chicago. He's not. He did not sign that particular document. The other 2, one is from PPI, and he has an honorary PhD from Iowa, and the other one is from Minnesota. So Roger, you are from Chicago, true, but you do not fit the stereotype of Chicago. Having on empirics a very superficial analysis. Thank you for that. I am going to only say one thing about your paper. Even though the word Africa is never mentioned in the written text, it applies to Africa in ways that his talk will make clear. And I'm going to help with a clip from the FT 2 days ago. Wild animals, poachers, and the human jungle. I thought that would be appropriate. It's a story of a guy that realized that just as insurgents tend to move across landscapes in predictable ways to plant landmines, poachers follow familiar patterns to place snares. So this fellow found out that terrorists are to poachers what improvised explosive devices, IEDs, are to animal snares. Now this man went to Washington asking NGOs to support the software that would allow him to apply this. He said, what? This military geek wants to help us do our own job? And he had a lot of trouble. So Gillian Tett, who's born an anthropologist, says that when you apply an innovative idea outside of its usual realm, people get puzzled. And I'm sure we saw those kinds of reactions many times, but we won't see today, because since Africa is not there, we can guess. Roger, welcome to NOVA. I could go on and on about this university. As you can see, it's wonderful, and everybody is waiting to see you. Half an hour. Good, thank you.
Privilege. I'm trying to get us back on schedule. I'm a theorist, and I cannot claim to we spend. Others should spend more time talking. I should try to present some ideas. I want to speak. I'm glad of the privilege of speaking at an Africa conference here in Lisbon, NOVA, because the great questions of development are the greatest questions of economics. On the path from anarchy to prosperity, what comes first? What is truly fundamental? That surely is the great fundamental question of economics, of all social science, or at least a great fundamental question of social science. Has Paul Collier arrived? Because this, I remember, this is...
He will be here later. The London flight is late.
The record is that I'm going to focus on something that's not development, but I think is another aspect of the same question and is therefore of interest to discussion on development. I want to focus on the question of situations like the unfortunate one the United States got itself into, certainly invading Iraq in 2003, an invasion I completely opposed, but once we had taken responsibility for another country, there was the question of what do you do next if you claim to be trying to promote a strong democratic state in a country that you have intervened in. What exactly are you supposed to do? I don't think anybody, certainly nobody in power in Washington, D.C. wants to think about this question anymore either. But I think the academics need to think about it. And to me, it crystallizes the one aspect. I have no illusions that invasions to bring democracy are to be desired. The only people who desire invasions in their country empirically are out-of-power politicians who hope to be brought to power by the invading army, and any other sensible person would prefer not to be invaded under almost any circumstance. But invasions have happened and will happen for whatever reason, and I take great inspiration from Paul Collier's suggestion in The Bottom Billion and elsewhere that perhaps problems of international development can be solved not just by money, but by establishing international charters of appropriate behavior in international natural resource fund flows, accountability. So I want to propose, and I hope that maybe he'll comment at some point as to whether this is a good submission to his agenda of proposing a charter for custodians of democratic state building. Not that we are endorsing it, but once you claim to be doing it, what do you need to do to be doing it effectively? Can democratic state building be distinguished from imperialist domination? It's not that simple. American government officials have tended to act as if just an election proved that we're not conquering this country. But of course that's not true. Elections are not enough. Here's the summary, since I'm running behind and should try to end as promptly as possible at 2:30. I'll say give the summary now and I can sit down immediately. And the summary says what I believe. The thesis I will try to argue is summarized in a few lines. With the broadest possible multinational support, occupying powers should foster political reconstruction based on two pillars: a multi-party National Assembly and elected local councils. Each should be funded with transparent budgets because, and that's the charter really, now the explanation, because democratic development depends on a plentiful supply of leaders who have good reputations for using public funds responsibly in both local and national politics. In developed economics, this really is a conference on development, there is a long and healthy tradition of people saying that their theory is that development depends on increasing the supply of something, capital, human capital, building state capacity. I want to argue, and I think maybe this is novel, but I think there's some truth in it. I'm sure there's some falsehood to it as well. But I would like to add to that list possibly a useful addition, that the supply of leaders who have good reputations for using public funds responsibly should be followed by international development workers and agencies as something, a supply of something that needs to be increased in countries, or international intervention should be increased. I'll try to focus on the application of the I think to speed things up, perhaps I usually put too many words on my slide. It's a bad habit, but also as a theorist, I have nothing but logic. So use the words, but perhaps I will try to do what one shouldn't do and read the slides mostly and thereby get through the argument as quickly as possible, not commentary. It is commonly argued that there is no cookie cutter, now we say cookie cutter, no cookie cutter, one-size-fits-all plan for political development. Of course, local culture is vital. I think the most important aspect of local culture may be how we recognize leaders in our culture. How do we determine who is a potential leader of our community, our communities, who isn't? But a theory that says there is no theory means that basically what you need to do is get experts in the local political culture to testify to you as to what this country needs. But local political experts are never neutral. And let me suggest what I think is the most important bias which has cursed recent American interventions in particular. The most prominent indigenous supporters of any foreign intervention, the people who welcome it and who are important people in their society, are typically expecting positions of power in the central government. And so they are going to tend to tell you what this country needs is a nice centralized state, because they expect to be part of the central government and they want power to be centralized. So there's a tendency to create for interveners to support states that are excessively centralized. That may also fit in with diplomats' tendency to focus on what's happening in the capital. But to avoid such biases, interveners, and more importantly, the public who hold them accountable for their promises to promote democracy, need to be relying on some general principles underlying politics and government in all societies. I had a lot of this morning a suggestion that there was not a development of Angola theory. There's a global theory of development. Every one of our countries has its own flavor to politics. there are general principles. Here is my one slide summarizing with too many words, but in one slide, everything that I think is important in a theory of where the state building. I should say that as an economist, I do believe, as you say, that that politics is fundamental. That we need to stop sweeping under the rug the questions of, oh, the state just takes care of these minimal things and then the market can take care of the rest. No, there can be no market without the state providing security and other public goods. And the state is people too, so we need to understand how the state works internally. And I think it begins with politicians, political leaders. Let me give you a quick theory of leadership. A leader, you can find in bookstores, in English certainly, shelves full of books about what is leadership. But I want to give you a short two-line theory. I think any leader, political or otherwise, most needs, first and foremost, a reputation for reliably rewarding good service, so as to be able to mobilize a network of active supporters. So the primary imperative for political leaders, from which all other laws, I've argued in an article in the 8th American Political Science Review in 2009, the primary imperative for political leaders is to maintain their supporters' trust that they will reliably reward good service. People are welcome to come and just put this about their space. A national now, there's a coordination problem. Who are our national leaders? And our understanding of who are, there are people here from countries that have suffered from the curse of prolonged civil war, where there was fundamental disagreement about who is the government, who is the supreme, controls the supreme institutions of government in this country. And disagreement about that is worse than it. Surely people on both sides would agree that either side would be better to be in charge than to have an endless civil war, although I prefer that my side would win, please. A national government depends on broad acceptance of its authorities by local leaders. I think in any community, especially in a country that's suffering from a failed state, in any community, we have institutions of local leadership. We have recognized local leaders in communities throughout the nation. And when those local leaders, so I want to argue it's not, quote, the people, I think. I think legitimacy of the national government depends on acceptance of its authority by the vast majority of the local leaders in different communities. It's not a presidential election where everybody's vote counts equally. It's the local community leaders, the local chiefs, the local bosses, the local aristocracy, the people who and everyone else depends on in their communities. But in the long run, local leadership depends on national recognition and support. Now, that's true of any system. In democracy, we think we're going to get better public service by forcing our leaders to compete for popular approval, competition, just as competition in the market. And obviously, popular elections are an essential part of democracy. Popular elections, more or less untainted, are spreading in the world and certainly spreading in Africa. But, excuse me, my mother in Florida has a long quarrel with the local election commissioner who is about to get reelected. The woman who runs the elections with insufficient transparency in Sarasota, Florida, and my mother is her nurse. So I know throughout the country there's a problem with there's problems with imperfect elections. But it is not enough to have elections that are reasonably free and fair, which we do have in Florida and in other parts of the world. Democratic development also depends on real competition in elections. What is real competition? In any market, you need to have alternative sources of supply that have a reputation for providing the service. If there's no trust that they will provide the service, they can't compete. So democratic development depends on, here's that word again, a plentiful supply of leaders who have good reputations for using public funds responsibly. If nobody but the guy in the presidential palace has ever really controlled a public budget, then nobody in the country, besides the guy in the presidential palace, has any reputation for spending public funds responsibly, and there can't be any serious competition. So I want to argue the democratic construction should be some two pillars: multi-party national assembly, elected local councils, as I said. I'll argue that local democracy lowers barriers. I started already saying that politics depends on interactions between local and national government politics. But local democracy lowers, the most important idea, I want to say, it lowers barriers to entry into national politics. People who have proven their ability to spend public budgets at the local level then become stronger candidates become serious candidates, can become serious candidates for higher national office. Conversely, multi-party national politics is needed to guarantee that local politics isn't dominated by local bosses. Local bosses need to know that some rival national party could sponsor competition if they are if they lose the popular trust in their community. The distribution of funds between national and local governments needs reliable public accounting under the finance ministry. Let me say it, the slide at the end says, I may not get there, that people should know when you trace the origins of English government, for example, and go back, you discover before Parliament, the foundations of the English monarchy that became the English government, and we were so able to dominate the world by the strength of its political institutions and society based on government. The first institution is the Exchequer. And you have to know that we have a dialogue of the Exchequer written around 1170 under King Henry II, which still exists and is worth reading. And in that, he tells you what the Exchequer is about. First and foremost, the accounting of a sheriff before the treasurer. It is about making public accounting. And they didn't have video cameras then. They would have used it. If you read the dialogue of the Exchequer, you see if they had video cameras, they would have put this on public television. It was about the sheriff's accounting with the treasurer, the central government and the provincial governors, making sure that the budget, the financial transactions between the central government and the provincial government are completely public and transparent. And a large, non-trivial subset of the power structure of England just sat and watched these transactions, and that was the first. So public accounting under the financial industry of the sharing of funds between national and local governments together. Government agencies and security forces and other pillars of the state must develop under political leadership, because if the political leaders don't sustain the bureaucratic incentive systems, nobody will. And so I want to argue that in some sense we need to recognize. Here I put in 4 slides, 4 bullet points, 4 different areas of economic theory that are underlying the argument about the theory of the state that I just posed. One is Schelling's focal point effect. We have to agree on who is the legitimate government in our country, or we suffer the curse of civil war and anarchy. But it's a coordination game. We understand it has multiple equilibria, and Schelling says anything that points at culture and tradition that points to one answer versus another can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. We all agree on that. So the need to coordinate about who is in charge makes public perception a compelling force, and the status of a recognized leader can become a self-confirming fact. Agency theory teaches us the importance of incentives in organizations. But who guarantees the promised incentives will be paid? The top lead, Alkin and Demsetz in 1972 wrote a classic paper where they argued that, everybody can be held accountable by a manager who's monitoring, but somebody at the top who has a basic ownership stake in the profits of this organization has to be monitoring it. Is the monitor of last resort, has to monitor the monitors and make sure that the promised incentive pay, the long-term rewards of good behavior will be paid out. That was Alkin Demsetz's argument. Anybody could raise their hand and say, but in the firm we don't really need an individual owner or an individual chief executive who has an ownership stake in the firm, because we can write a contract. That would be a good Chicago answer. Well, guess what? You don't always want to go to the courts of law to adjudicate all these contract disputes, but if we're talking about a political party, a political faction that exists to take charge of the country, you can't have access to a court of law. There's no higher court than your leader. So I want to argue that certainly in politics, as opposed to non-profit political organizations, non-political organizations may look to the courts of the state, but political organizations that exist to take power in the state itself must ultimately look to the leaders of their faction for guaranteeing the incentive. So I want to argue that political leaders are the ultimate guarantors of incentive systems in their society, and in particular, those we're hoping to create state capacity by creating bureaucracies that have reliable incentives. If there isn't a consensus among the political leaders of the main political factions that these bureaucratic incentives are how we in fact want to pay our civil servants, how we want to reward our civil servants, how we want to promote and pay them, then these are nonsense. It begins with politics. Powerful agents must trust the political leaders in the allocation of moral hazard rents. Repeated gains, reputationally delivered repeated gains. Individuals can be strongly motivated by the long-term benefits of maintaining a good reputation with others. So the key to successful leadership is a reputation for reliably rewarding good service. Leaders, once you're recognized as a leader, you have a shot at it, but if you can't mobilize support, you'll lose your leadership structure, your leadership position in any system. And so the first law, the first basis of all constitutional law, I argued in 2009, in the American Political Science Review, is this need to maintain a reputation. Finally, I've already talked about barriers to entry. In economics and oligopoly theory in economics, a key idea is that the profits depend on barriers to entry. The level of profits is determined more than anything else by the structure of barriers to entry. If you carry that to democratic theory, the profit-taking by political leaders depends on lowering barriers to entry. Effectiveness of democratic competition depends on reducing political entry barriers, enabling new leaders to build reputations for spending public funds well. First of all, the leaders, they have to spend public funds on giving jobs to their supporters. But to win votes, they have to also spend public funds. They have to make sure that the supporters who they give jobs to actually deliver some public goods. Those who compete in any system don't want it more competitive. So established leaders, we should recognize, have an interest, a vested interest in high entry barriers, high political entry barriers. So if I can tell you what lowers political entry barriers, we should find that the people who are in power in any country get a little nervous about that. I think the leaders when I come close to people with high political power, I think I've come close to people who have as much as anybody that I've ever met interest in the general welfare of their country. I think that we all feel some benevolence, and I believe that our political leaders in most countries feel a certain benevolence. But nonetheless, we should not take benevolence too seriously. We economists, we should also recognize they have an interest in higher entry barriers. Allowing locally elected councils in particular, as I've argued, to exercise some autonomous authority can reduce entry barriers into national politics. It's not on the slide here, but I think it was in the ACRA document from a few years ago. One of the suggestions was that international development agencies should allow minority factions in national assemblies to submit for international grant funding. It's a very good idea. It's another way. I'll focus on autonomous local government, but minorities in minority parties should also have some ability, even though they don't control the national budget, to have some to show the public how they can spend money on public good better than the current government by having a little money supplied by the World Bank, may I suggest. But this competitive effect is lost if local governors are appointed by the president. Moral hazard rents of local government are going to be important. There's agency problems. We understand that because people who are responsible for government in provinces and cities and towns it's hard for them to be monitored from the capital at all times. So there are going to be moral hazard rents. The president, in any sense, there's a great. Therefore, being a governor of a province is a valuable thing, is a valuable position. And the president would like to build his power base by reliably giving rewards to his supporters, would like to appoint governors. If he has to stop appointing governors, he's going to lose the ability, a large part of the ability he's been using to motivate his supporters by the promise that if they work hard, they'll get a governorship. In Europe, parties are disciplined by loyal party supporters know that if they work hard at the end of their careers, they may get a ministry. but not a governorship. That's the difference. Effectiveness of local government can suffer when positions of local authority become rewards in the national patronage system based in the capital. But as I've argued, conversely, it's very easy if the local elections be dominated by a traditional local boss and who makes it all a sham. Local politics depends on national politics also. National politics, because rival national parties can sponsor competition for unpopular local bosses. So effective democracy depends on, in successful democracies, effective democracy depends on interactions between local and national politics. People will say, you can't build democracy overnight in another country, and I guess that seems to be right empirically, but I'm a theorist and I cannot tolerate the fact that what are we supposed to say? I'm sorry, you have to go through 500 years of European history and then you can have democracy. No, let's figure out how democracy really works, and it's not presidential elections. I don't think they work in the United States, I'm sorry, but so the need for standards. Why are elections not enough? First of all, in brief, it's got to be said. It's obvious, but it's got to be said. When the Marines have taken over this country on behalf of, say, me, the President of the United States, I can install an interim leader who gets to. There was a patronage network in the country, but this was the old regime. It either collapsed or it was destroyed by our invading forces. We destroyed Saddam Hussein's ability to his patronage network, and now nobody has a network of trust. Nobody has a reputation with people throughout the country for distributing benefits other than those people who we just killed or exiled. So we get to install an interim leader who gets to develop the first national patronage network. Then we get a commission. We're going to make it a democracy, so it needs a constitution. But our leader will supervise the constitutional process. We'll have lots of people on the Constitutional Commission from different factions, but somebody's got to be a majority, and we'll make sure that a majority is people who are supporters of our interim leader. The Constitutional Commission can then write a strong presidential constitution. Abdulaziz al-Hakim in Iraq thought he was going to get a different position, so the Iraqi constitution is not presidential, but certainly the Afghan constitution concentrates power in a presidency, and it was written, and the future and still current president, his supporters basically dominated the commission. So we write a constitution that concentrates power in one office that the interim leader expects to win, called the presidency. The president, the people are then given a choice: vote for this constitution, or who knows what happens, anarchy. So it gets ratified. Then a national presidential election, as people just observed in Egypt, demands that voters concentrate on a few candidates. If everybody votes for the candidate that they like best, then large blocks of voters split their vote among multiple candidates and end up with no voice. And it's the smaller, and it's the disciplined blocks of voters that win, so everybody's got to line up in a disciplined vote. So a presidential election demands that voters coordinate on a few candidates. The interim leader naturally can become a focal contender. He's got the patronage army. He also, by the way, does control the electoral, has administrative influence on the electoral process. So it's not unlikely that the interim leader is going to be claimed as elected president, but his position really is owed to the foreigners called the Americans who was installed. This is not to say, I'm not trying to suggest that the government in Afghanistan, for example, that this looks just like the constitutional process in Afghanistan. I do not think that the government of Afghanistan personally is an imperial stooge of the Americans. It certainly depends on America, but you certainly can't tell the difference. There's nothing objective about the process that can distinguish it, and if the Taliban want to argue, no, we have to destroy it because this is an American invasion, an American imposed regime, they have a point. I don't think that. I'd like to think they're wrong, but I'm an American, so I'm certainly biased also. By the self-perpetuating nature of leadership, the foreigner's political interventions can have lasting effects for at least a decade or a generation or more. And a society's norms unless the people generally reject the intervention's legitimacy, a society's norms for identifying its authoritative leaders are really its core cultural asset. So now I'm going to try to get to and perhaps setting standards for state building may help to make it less unacceptable. But we should recognize The goal is to create opportunities for new democratic leadership, which is, by the way, the thing that the guy in the presidential palace doesn't want, or at least is against his interests, unless he is truly benevolent and can focus on this, that his nation needs more people other than himself who have good reputations for responsible democratic behavior, which means playing by the rules of the electoral process, not using violence against opponents, but also means spending public funds in the public interest. So the key political goal, there it is in boldface, is to increase the national supply of leaders who have good reputations for spending public funds responsibly. That's the point of the talk in 26 minutes. There it is in 1 minute. Not just to provide patronage benefits to their supporters, but reputations for spending public funds responsibly. Such reputations get only developed by having opportunities to spend public funds. And to me, so now we should scratch our heads and think, structurally, how do you create more opportunities to develop such reputations for spending public funds responsibly? How about by devolving some share of the public budget to autonomously elected local councils? Appropriate incentives to government agencies, of course, to be sure to limit political supervision. I've argued that the political leaders are the ultimate guarantors of the incentive system in any public agency, and local councils are typically better placed than the people in the capital to supervise certain kinds of local public service agencies, including probably police and primary education. But who in the capital wants to give up control of the patronage? So let me try to get practical about mitigating the intervener's influence and installing national leaders. Obviously, when I suggest devolving power to locally elected councils, it begins to sound like the American intervention under this plan, which the Americans don't want to think about. So whoever's doing this, the NATO intervention under this plan would be partitioning the country. No, a national government is needed and should be constituted, and the foreign interveners are going to need to have some role in constituting a cabinet, not just ministers, but ministers who can work together in a cabinet to create a coherent national government that can take responsibility for the national government that is needed. But this initial selection can be made reversible by allowing a majority in a broader assembly to replace the cabinet anytime afterward. So, yeah, we interveners choose, we may guide the selection of the first cabinet, but if those people in this broad National Assembly can reach a majority coalition, fine, they can change it. That's called a parliamentary system, of course. So parliamentary system in the interim regime certainly makes sense, even if something, the formation of the assembly may also need supervision by the interveners, and for that multinational oversight, inviting other countries to help recruit some minority, some portions of the National Assembly can make an initial National Assembly more representative. Then local elections if you hold local elections, you're unlikely to be able to guarantee that your guys will win, the favored candidates will win in all the local elections. So representations from local councils, after they've been formed, can broaden the assembly. So here's the chart. I'll call yours in here, but here's my charter, and so I'll read it. With the broadest possible multinational political supervision, I suggest the intervening powers. I should say, I'm hoping this is the first salvo and the first opening shot in a dialogue about how to write such a charter. It's an interesting exercise. I can't claim to have proven anything, but here it is. Here's my charter, and you can attack it now and write a better one. With the broadest possible multinational political supervision, the intervening power should sponsor a broadly representative international assembly. And the Americans can invite the Russians and the Iranians to each nominate 5% of the assembly. We don't have to do it. So we can make it multinational. National executive ministers in a transitional period should be responsible to the assembly and the parliamentary system with constructive no confidence votes. That's with the participation of the parties in the national interim assembly. So the members of the National Assembly can form parties, and any group that's large, that satisfies at least say 10%, can then become registered as a national party that then co-sponsors local elections to choose local councils in districts throughout the country. Once these local councils in place, now we should reconstitute the transitional assembly to include or just be representatives of these local councils who report report back to the local councils and can be replaced at any time by their respective local councils. Funds need to be allocated transparently to the local councils and to the national executive. The foreign donors of funds should help the National Finance Ministry to get going, and Ashraf Ghani is about this, to give people a full accounting of the funds spent at all levels. For two reasons. One is, our spending money in your country is politically influencing your country, and we should have sunshine on that so that you know what we're doing, and we're not, and if we're using it for imperialistic purposes, the exposure to public scrutiny may help the people of the country to undo it. But also, for the practical reason, the whole point is that the leaders of the National Assembly and the leaders of the local councils are supposed to begin to develop reputations for spending public funds responsibly, and that means people in the country need to know what funds did they get. And if they stole it, as some of them will, they've lost their chance of creating a reputation, but they can't spend it worse than the United States spent money in Iraq in 2003, 2004. In the commission, finally, in the commission to draft a permanent constitution, I've suggested this. I don't think anybody's ever suggested adding democracy to the process of creating a democratic constitution, but a minority report, say any group of 1/3 or more of the commission, should be able to report an alternative draft for the national ratification vote. So let me finish by saying the evidence, the primary institution of medieval England, I said the exchequer, was first and foremost, you should understand, beginning in about 1120, the English government begins with an institution for public accounting, genuine public accounting of transactions between the national and provincial governments. The next great institutional development in England around 1300 was the Parliament, but Parliament, you should understand, was a national political forum for local leaders who also had responsibility for taxation. England's road system, talk about development. England begins to pull ahead. The Industrial Revolution is based on England having the best transportation system in the world from the 1700s. That began with the turnpike trusts, which were supervised by autonomous local governments. The first transitional government in the United States was characterized by decentralization and parliamentary responsibility, the Articles of the Confederation. That's probably the best model of what I'm talking about. The Constitutional Convention of the United States didn't actually make any provision for minority report. It didn't think of that. Madison didn't suggest that. Recent American interventions, however, cultivated more centralized regimes. That is my criticism. So I'll stop. Let me just say, in praising local government, it took me a long time to find out. This is a theoretical harangue. I should stop. My time is short for that. And I hope it will stimulate discussion. I hope there's time for discussion, but the only sources I have found for international comparison of local democracy is from United Cities and Local Governments, which is an international organization that sponsors mostly mayors and such to promote and monitor local democracy. And there's their website. If you're looking for research projects that compare local democracy in different countries, that's a good place to start finding data and references to the various papers that do things more public. So I'll shut up.
Like a malevolent leader, because as Roger was developing his ideas, I was told we have a little bit more time. So I had two choices. One was to tell him go on, and the other one was to extend the discussion. I chose the latter. First question, is there a mic for the questions? Where is John? You don't have a mic? There are no questions? Yes. Oh, it's not going to like that. No, the mic. We need a mic to ask questions. No? Okay. So, first question. Sorry, I heard it there.
You spoke about the leader. Rodrigo Garcia. You spoke about the leader, but a lot of the people who are in charge, who rule, are not leaders by your definition. They're powerful people, but do not necessarily represent any constituency or have a reputation. How do you sort of put the two together? A powerful person who might be an autocrat, and I mean, I see few cases of governments outside.
To become president of the United States, you need millions of people to vote for you. There are many countries where you can become the president or a high public official without millions of people voting for you. That's a prejudice, obviously, of democracy. I didn't say, I hope I made it very, I don't believe anybody, I don't believe any of the countries with the most authoritarian regimes. You know, in the most authoritarian regimes, I believe the number one attribute of the leader, of the guy who's on top, is that there's a large group of the ruling elite who feel this is a person I can do business with. I was not surprised when I heard an Iraqi exile talking in public some years before the American invasion, where he talked about the time that Saddam Hussein called him to try to get him to come back. Oh, you know, we have this relationship, don't forget it's safe to come back. And then the guy says, other people like me who went back got killed, but Saddam Hussein has had, you know, Joe Stalin was somebody who killed his collaborators, but then he'd eat dinner with them every night to try to reestablish trust. That doesn't mean that there is any particular subset of the population that supports. In democracy, there should be a subset of the population that votes for. That doesn't necessarily mean they like the person. I think a lot of Republicans are going to vote for Mitt Romney without liking him. But you know, but nobody can be a leader. I'm arguing with, and I think if you know more about a country that has an authoritarian, non-democratic leader, I think you know that that's a person who is trusted. His promises and his threats are believed by a lot of people in the government, not necessarily by the person in the street. But I think that's an essential element. That's what I call the network power that I'm talking about.
I don't want to police you in the late least, but I mean, we have a question here next to you, and you know, we'll try to keep this limited to the video.
I also have a question.
Yeah.
My name is Paolo from Angola, and I would like to start by also though. I like a lot the idea of possibility of climate happening in democracy as possible as far as the relations between local, because local and the national government, thing that occurs. But I think the whole idea is sustained with this theoretical framework upon an idea of intelligence actually theory. And there is a slide with an oversight concerning the idea of structure. It takes me into push you into the theoretical framework to assist non-democratic contest or a contest, political contest, whereby the incumbents are very much exercising what you call centralized, monopoly centralized in the government. So for obvious reasons, sometimes for political gains, and political gains generates also an economic and business gains for case of ongoing business. Even though has been a reason for applause this morning, the last election, I think there is reasons to cry or even being saddened by the way the process was planning staged. Even. So everyone they wish even how do you apply the frameworks for the context of Angola in order to make its weakened democratic system a more effective democratic system. The problem is that the local assemblies are very much overworked that we kind of
I think so. There are local elected assemblies for the provinces of Angola,
no,
districts.
There's
no local. So if there were local elections, I think one good counterexample to my argument, effective counterexample, not good, is I know in the decline of the first democratic government in Sierra Leone in the 70s and 80s, there were local councils, just local elected councils. In the 1960s, 1970s, just like I'm suggesting, their budgets were completely untransparent from William Reno's account of it, and everybody came to understand that the money depended on the presidential palace, and President Stevens ultimately made those councils irrelevant. He had to work with the local chiefs who were not popularly elected, so that there was only. If I could talk to the president of the ruling elite of Angola, who have presided over a country which has come from terrible civil war, towards democracy, and as I say, democracies everywhere are imperfect, but have certainly been moving the country in what is clearly a positive direction. I would say when you think about evolving power to creating local assemblies and devolving some budgetary power to them, you will start worrying about the fact that some of those valuable appointments on which you base your political system are now no longer going to be controlled by you. On the other hand, if you do this some years before you have to run for re-election, you will begin to be able, whichever councils are elected, you will begin to be the first chance of developing a reputation with them, of working with them according to some legal boundaries. If they start trying to make a civil war, of course, the army they only control lightly armed police, if anything. But you have an opportunity to develop a reputation for working with your locally elected councils, which were going to be a large part of the local elite. And whoever runs against you in the next election is not going to have that reputation because they've never done it. So allow yourself some time, and you may be able to preside over a country that's better for Angola, and you will continue to rule with some expectation. Of course, you can't guarantee, with democracy, you can't guarantee you're going to be in power until you die, but that's democracy. So that would be my argument, is it can be done in such a way that the current national leadership has the best opportunity to continue to prove that it can be the national government that the local governments want to support for the most part. But you will now be creating opportunities for local officials to spend their own money. I would say the international agencies to support this by trying to help with the accounting, by trying to say that some of the public funds we're giving to Angola, let's do whatever we can to help develop the finance ministry's ability to monitor the sharing of oil wealth according to a statutory, whatever the Angolan government defines as the statutory sharing of oil revenues with its local government, giving 20% of the revenue, whatever, of the public revenue. Whatever fraction it is, foreign agencies can try to help monitor that and help make it reliable. That's not intervention, just helping with the transparency. That's my first kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Sorry to monitor your time, but I know so many people are asking. And please, you are Paulo from Angola. You are, please tell me afterwards if I've gone seriously wrong. Yes, I'm sorry.
Olga Schmeria, Georgia Institute of Technology. Originally Central Asia, from Central Asia. I'm tagging on the first question about what should be the succession mechanism, or how to develop a succession mechanism when you have a strong man which has been in power for a long time and who is suppressing opposition. But, if a strong man dies unexpectedly, like the whole country can collapse because so many things are tied in one person. How to deal with that?
One answer is what I just said, which is that in new institutions where whoever is going to be a candidate for power in the future needs a reputation for using the power in a way that others trust. If the rules of the power change, the current people in power and the people have the first opportunity to show what they can do with it and to show that to use them in a trustworthy way. Second thing, if I were to recommend democratization in China, I would not suggest that everybody in the country should be able to create a new political party. We do need multi-party democracy. There's the old dictator is appointed to the National Assembly. They consist of his cronies, but these are people. And if you say any 10% of them can form a new political party, if the old president, has truly lost the faith of a majority of the population, if the forms of democracy work. Of course, if we don't count the ballots, nothing counts. But if there's any truth to the forms of democracy, then the opportunity to create a new party that then participates in supervising the election and has the right to nominate candidates anywhere becomes the right to form faction. I was your crony, you appointed me things, I've done all, but now I know everybody hates you. It's my chance now to form a new party. And I think that the president of such a country would know he can't trust his assembly. So he's now left with the one alternative, which is to try to remain genuine. That's genuinely popular, which means do something good for the people. But I'm a theorist, so maybe I'm not idealist. But that is my attempt to understand the truth. The point is that we understand that both through the ability to build a reputation for how you spend money, how you control large public budgets, and through the focal point effect of being a recognized leader, that just being a leader is a lot of power, and an economist believes that there's nothing wrong. I certainly believe at the end of the communist system that it wasn't communist versus capitalist. Members of the Communist Party were people, and they had motivations. It was a system, and if you would change the system, these are smart people, and of course they did. And many dissidents, there were dissidents who became dictators, and there were former party hacks who, under a democratic system, became, in various countries, admirable democratic politicians, and that includes the former dictator of the country, I suppose.
We continued at the break. Francesco?
Yes, Francesco Franco from Nova. Maybe I'm off mark, but I was intrigued by your example of the exchequer.
Louder, please.
I was intrigued by the example you used of the exchequer because it reminded me the old question of which is the right sequence in the treatment. Is it to be the economic, bare, necessary institution before trying to democratize it? I go to the applied, basically, type of
And certainly people
question.
have said it is a major theme in development economics today, the building state capacity, which means building a bureaucracy the thing you have to do first and foremost in bureaucracy is by paperwork you keep track of the flow of funds and also the flow of orders that go to ultimately with backing the police force to compel people to do things. You keep track of all that so we reduce moral hazard in the agencies. The developing a skilled bureaucracy is important, and I have argued it is fruitless to try to create a bureaucracy that is not supported by the political leadership. Civil service reforms began with a sense by multiple political parties that having each of us completely reconstitute the government every time was bad for all of us, and we should agree on some rules. Politicians have to agree on what the rules are. And therefore it begins with, but when we think about what a bureaucracy is trying to do, I wanted to focus that the truth is, in the evolution of English government, which did rely on a skilled bureaucracy, that the first function of that bureaucracy was to regulate with public accountability the relationship between the national and the local governments. And it's really literally the provincial governments, because the sheriffs it's people who we would now call provincial governors who are reporting to the treasurer. The parliament, it becomes a new form of political institution, which is regulating the king's relationship between the central government and the local governments at the village and town levels.
So do you think we should have the parliamentaries before the sheriff?
So I think what I'm trying to say was that when we think about state capacity, just reading William Reno's excellent book on the breakdown of what sounded like good institutions in Sierra Leone. And the first thing I see is that the budgets of the local councils that actually existed were not reliable. That there was no reliable accounting for what they did and didn't get to spend. It was manipulable. Ultimately, democracy depends on people, on broad popular understanding of certain rules. But people have to have some information. Free press is obviously essential, and international donors understand that allowing public criticism of the government is something we want to demand in exchange for international financial support. But I want to argue that we should focus on state capacity, that there's no other state capacity for anything else. State capacity for regulating the revenue shares between the central and national and local governments in a reliable public way. To me, it's what happened in England first, and it's what I would suggest in Germany today.
Other questions? Yes, please. Now we're getting to run out of time. There will be, but in case I have to leave, Guido will fill the questions if he still agrees. Now, I have agreed with Tiago, the student leader back there, that he would ask one question, but he's reneging on that. So we have 2 questions here, and one that I want to ask you as well, if you allow me. Please, no, I think you will start it first. Please, would you give your name so it helps to network afterwards if you say who you are.
So my name is Ole Rasmussen. I'm from University of London. So thanks for a very interesting presentation. You're saying that a lot of things go wrong, and I think you also said particularly a lot of things went wrong in Iraq. And I think you said even more particularly, America did some things wrong in Iraq.
Yes.
So then my question is, why did they do so many things wrong? So, for example, was it ability? Of course, they didn't have your child, but was it because they didn't know what to do? Was it, or was it will? Was it because they didn't want to do it?
This
last
paper
point
is
that
done.
you said. Yeah.
I confess, I'm still working on frustration that the American government supported with so little discussion. There was no planning as to what they did. I went to see my congressman early on, just after May 2nd of 2003. He said, you know, yeah, nope. It's not. He wasn't just a congressman. He's in the Naval Reserve. He's an officer of the United States Naval Reserve. On missions over Iraq, and he said, you know, nobody's talking about this. I'll forward it to something, whatever. He did, of course, it was constituent service. I have since become friends with Harvard Professor Megan O'Sullivan, who was Paul Bremer's right hand, was involved in everything. Paul Bremer is a smart guy. You can read his book. He had his theory. I've written my critique of his book. I think he's a smart guy, but he was the wrong theory. Among other things, he began with the sense that that the democracy begins with a constitution, which is certainly false in the United States. It began before we had a constitution. And therefore he would not allow any elections until there was a constitution, and the constitution had to be negotiated nationally. Maybe he was as well qualified to make up the theory as I was. His theory has been proven wrong. I haven't done any power, so my theory hasn't been proven wrong. I think, and by the way, in order to avoid giving power to any one Iraqi faction, which was the obvious thing to do, he honestly prevented himself from creating a new client dictator or interim leader who could take power under American authority. In the way that I suggested. How did he do that? By spending the money himself, by controlling it. So he imposed imperial colonial control over the government in order to avoid selecting an interim leader. Everybody thought he was going to choose Ahmed Chalabi, but he wasn't smart enough to do that. That might have been better for Iraq, at least in the short term, maybe not the long term. It would have been the Iraqi government would be our stooge. If anything, the Iraqi government is the client of Iran more than the United States. Whatever. We didn't even do that imperialism very well. I think he was wrong, but I get a terrible feeling.
Don't cry for me, Argentina, as they say about imperialism.
Very short question about still from Norway. Very short question about all these overview that's presented on the historical origins of representative institutions. And I very strongly agree with your position that the compromise between local powers and powers for centralization in order to raise state revenues is a very strong force for proper democratic or representative institutions. And we can even argue on the other way around. States in the more recent past or several centuries ago that would rely on natural resources that didn't have the possibility or didn't have the need to have this compromise, representative institutions would be in some way denied or prevented to be built. My question is about time. For instance, the evolution of England or the evolution of other European countries had several centuries to build up this proper democratic or these specific institutions. Nowadays, for developing countries, time is probably more evident and more pressing than the evolution, the past evolution of European countries. So
I've tried. One of the theories I'm trying to argue against is the default. We just have to allow them time to certainly people coming to demand that their leaders should submit to regular contested elections in order to retain the aura of legitimacy that is essential to their being our leaders. The general acceptance of their being our leaders is something that requires acceptance by everyone. That inevitably takes time. I think, by the way, that process in much of Africa is going forward rather well. That there are many countries in Africa where the leaders know that they have to have some kind of contested election in order to maintain acceptance, continued acceptance of their rule. And that's good. I think that's how democracy spreads. I think democracy is a good thing, and I think that's a good thing. But I think that there's something missing for truly competitive democracy. And I tried to argue that what comes with the fullness of time, but I realize that I don't know enough about the process of democratization in this country. I have not studied, and I apologize before coming here speaking. I learned recently that in October of 1910, the Republic was proclaimed in Lisbon City Hall. That's in terms of my theory, that makes me think that it was people who were running an autonomous Lisbon government who were able to substitute themselves to the royal government based on their reputation for spending public funds. I don't know. That's just based on one. But and I may be completely wrong on who it was that brought about the republic, the transition to a republic. But I think that. So I've tried to say. Let me end with. I wrote something on a blog entry. Was it? What's her name? Yulia Tymoshenko from Ukraine wrote an article in Al Jazeera saying to Egypt, you're becoming a democracy, it's just going to take time, that's what we've learned in Ukraine. So that's, that sounds wise, but that's hopeless advice. Article 162 of the old Egyptian constitution promised in an English translation word gradually, that gradually local councils would be formed and given responsibility. They were never given any. Locally elected councils were never created. The Egyptians have now learned that to have a president, as I said, to make a presidential election, they needed not to have many people they trusted. Large groups of voters had to agree there was only one person they trusted and agree on which one that was, or their section. They would be essentially disenfranchised by splitting their vote. And it became a contest between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military faction. Even though a majority probably could have been put together in other ways, there was nobody they trusted. So if instead the transition to Egypt, people have been talking about Egyptian democracy begins by creating those local elected councils, and then before the presidential election, then you have some people who begin to create, to build democratic reputations, and if you elect a president, everybody thinks that all patronage, there's been a long tradition of all patronage coming out of the presidential palace through directly and indirectly through a long network that the past president, occupant of that palace, built throughout the network built throughout the country. And everyone thinks whoever gets elected next, and that is going to create the same patronage network. Somehow we have to break that by creating opportunities for other local patronage networks. And so I just thought starting with the president, that's just a case study of starting with the presidential. It's not, Egypt doesn't need centuries. Egypt has had more centuries than any other country in the world of political national political life. What they need is more. I've given them more people who have had opportunities to spend autonomous budgets publicly, and who can then offer themselves, as you see how I spent it. Many of them will spend it corruptly, but the ones that don't can then be our candidates, president or prime minister. That's the thing.
I have a thought question for you. You really wowed me on the text with you quoting Xenophon is coming from there. Now, the thought question I have for you is one of those Nobel Prizes for Romney, Jim Buchanan, who turns out to be an honorary doctor from Nova way back when. What, in your view, is different from the public choice, as Buchanan and Pollack like to tell us? It's a thought question, which is extremely benign, but I thought I would bring it up. How different are you?
That's a good question, isn't it? I haven't, and the short answer is, it's been years since I read Calculus of Consent. I used to see Jim Buchanan at meetings, but he didn't impress me that much, so I didn't follow up on so I'm not going to be able to say how different. I will say that much of standard modeling in economic models of politics today is based on spatial models, spatial voting, where people it's all about arguing policy preferences. William Riker argued that there were two forms, liberalism and populism, as two parts of political theory. Populism being that the problem to be solved in national politics is aggregating different interests. What I have been acting is what Riker would call a liberal perspective, where in liberalism, the point of democracy is to restrain our public officials, no matter who we elect, whatever ethnic or social or class or whatever group we think they, quote, are represent or are gaining their primary support from. Ultimately, once they're in power, they have an incentive to stay in power and to, and by the way, their chief supporters want them, even if they themselves are not particularly greedy people, they need to support legions of supporters whose aggregate desires are. And so I think perhaps I am.
Okay, great.
Very good.
Shall we first the Buchanan next? Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks a lot.
Let me make an announcement, please. So we have some delayed sessions. So basically we are delaying the whole program by half an hour. Okay, so I think that's the easiest way to do it. So just half an hour delay from everything you have in the program schedule. Thank you. Thank you very much.